Shalom everyone, and welcome back to another podcast by Hebrew in Israel. I really hope you're enjoying the program so far. I do apologize for posting every once in a while, but I do have many things in my personal life that prevent me from producing podcasts on a regular basis. But when I am able to make one, I'm very glad to make it. I hope you're also able to visit the website Hebrew in Israel, and if you think that what I do is beneficial and helps you, if you want, you can drop a little bit something to help with the research and the work done to produce these podcasts. I also want to point out that I also have a Patreon these days, and when you go on Patreon, you have access to many exclusive things that I also do, which are not available to the general public. Now, the subject of today's podcast is Kabbalah witchcraft? Kabbalah being the esoteric study of the so-called divine realm of Judaism is put into question all the time by individuals who enter Torah, and some people want to accept it and others object to it. And there is a very important question that sits in the center of this entire thing, and that is Kabbalah witchcraft? Now, why do people ask this question? And the answer is, first of all, because there is a very distinctive lack of knowledge of what it is. Also, that there is a very distinctive sense that anything Judaism does which is not in the Bible is somehow forbidden or a corruption of God's will. This is a very common sentiment that you find within certain groups that want to follow Torah but are not necessarily interested in being involved in Judaism. But this also has a very long history that goes back into the relationship between Judaism and Christianity, to such an extent that we actually have Roman writers that describe Jews as being heavily involved or being very good wizards of sorts, people who deal with witchcraft and so on. The problem is that these descriptions may actually be kind of distorted and not necessarily a representation of what was going on in earlier versions of Judaism. And this may actually be part of the problem, that the lack of understanding of things creates a problematic understanding of what these concepts are. However, I have to premise this from the beginning. I am not a Kabbalist. I actually stay completely far away from it. I did spend about 18 months at a much younger age. We're talking, something like 15 years ago. I did spend some time of about 18 months studying under a friend of mine who's a Kabbalist. And eventually, after about 18 months, I came to the conclusion that these teachings are questionable, problematic, things that we probably should not be studying at all, and we parted way. We're still friends to this very day, but he came to the realization that I am not open to these types of concepts and that I actually completely object to them. And when I studied this, I only studied really the theoretical side. And the theoretical side, it by itself felt very, very problematic. So we have to talk about all these little details and so on. Now, what prompted me to make this podcast is really because several friends of mine who are teachers within, for lack of a better term, Hebrew roots style type of groups. Each person has their objection to different terms, so I'm just using this as general. Don't pick on the term. And what happened was they were attacked, for example, using some Jewish source, and the Jewish source has some reference to something that is considered to be Kabbalistic to some degree. Usually this is very low-grade Kabbalah, very simple things that's used by, say, Chabad teachers and so on, just to give a bit of that, good spice of Kabbalah into things to make people feel as if they're entering into some secret realm and so on. And they got attacked for this, and they turned around to me as one of their Jewish friends and as a person who has a bachelor's in history, a master's in biblical studies, spent years in yeshiva, studied many aspects of Judaism. I was actually offered to take the rabbinic exams, and I kind of refused because I realized that wasn't really me. I was trying to be very truthful about things. And I even have people turn around to me asking me if I'm a rabbi, and my answer is no, I'm not. I openly say this. I'm not a rabbi, and I don't pretend to be one, even though I've had multiple rabbis turn around to me and say, look, your level of knowledge is not of a simple person. But I prefer to go on the academic line and using those methods. But in any case, they were attacked for using certain symbology or talking about certain concepts. There's a very popular concept of the pardes, which is used for pshat, remez, drash, and sod. And these ideas of there's a simple meaning, and then there's a midrash, which kind of basically is an exegesis, and there's a remez, or first of all, it's pshat, remez. Remez is like there's a hint here to something secretive. Drash, which is the exegesis, and then the sod, which is the secret, even though sod in biblical Hebrew really means an assembly, used actually as what's called sod Adonai, the assembly of God, which appears, for example, in the book of Job, and also appears in the book of Kings. And there's nothing, the term sod is more about counsel. It's not about some secretive thing. That's the original meaning of the word. But words change throughout time, and we're going to talk about this term Kabbalah as well. But when people talk about Kabbalah, most of what people talk about Kabbalah is the latter development of this concept from around the 15th century, and particularly under the teachings of Rabbi Luria, known as the Ari, and then his students like Rabbi Chaim Vital, and also the variations of this as used by Sephardic Kabbalists, North African, Eastern Kabbalists, but mostly North African, and the Kabbalist families like the Abu Hatzera family and people like that. We also have the Mekubalim of Tzfat, which are the ones who are directly connected to the Ari, and the concepts of the Zohar, which is probably a combination of many books that were put into one place. And Moshe de Leon collected these documents from lots of different places, made them into one book. They were written over an extended period of time of probably several hundred years, and written in multiple variations of Aramaic. There's, as far as I know, at least about 11 different dialects of Aramaic in this, written over different periods of time. And we get the Zohar, and that's pretty much what people know as Kabbalah today, but actually it has a much longer history than this. But what's very interesting is the moment this concept burst through, and especially when Rabbi Chaim Vital decided to break the oath that he actually gave his teacher, the Ari, not to spread his writings and not to present these writings to the world, it completely changed. And now we get the Lurian Kabbalah, which is a term you can look up. There's a lot of literature about it. And it is built on the concept that there is a light of some sort that comes down to the earth or into our existence. Kabbalists don't talk about God. They never really talk about God. We have the concept of the Godhead, the what's called Kachbad, Keter Chochmah Bina Da'at, but no one talks about the Keter. It's only from Chochmah Bina Da'at. That's the top of the Godhead, and so on. And I use the term Godhead because it's actually quite important to the understanding of what we're actually looking at, because the Godhead is something that's common amongst Christians and Jews. And it's a term that relates to something divine, but each group talks about it differently. So we're only going to focus about the Jewish group. And then this breaks down into the 10 sfirot, which are basically 10 spheres, a concept that Greeks talk about. We actually have, if I remember correctly, I think Plato talks about 10 spheres, and so on. So we have to understand that there is a very particular version of Kabbalah that's very popular today. Has a very particular style to it, but when we actually look at the earlier versions of this, it was slightly different, but still rides on the same wagon of concepts. Now, when we talk about the term Kabbalah itself, and you have to understand this is a very, very broad concept, and there are people out there who are this is their work. There are people even on YouTube. I mean, I found a very interesting YouTube channel that deals with the questions of esoteric teachings from all over the world, and the concepts that need to be grasped here are very, very broad. There's a lot of information when it comes to these things. I never dove that deep into it, but I've studied enough to have a good command of the concepts. So we have the 10 spheres, and then they break off into male and female, which is one of the main objections people have for those who know more about these concepts. And there's 2 male forms, 2 female forms, and so on. And there's a whole concept of what this light is, and is it God condensing himself, or it's not? It's just a light. It's not God himself. The debate of tzimtzum, very, very highly debated subject amongst Kabbalists. And then from there, we start talking about the chariot. So I'm talking more about the lines of the Ramchal, Rabbi Moshe Chaim Luzzatto, which was lived in the 16 to 1700s. And I studied that style more than anything else because it was what the specific teacher was teaching. And we end up with this very complicated world of basically parallel universes, I would say, to fit kind of the terminology very popular today. And we have these realms and these beings and these angels, and we have the Metatron, which is a Greek term that somehow became the name of some angel that sits in God's presence, and he's basically like the secretary of God of some sort. And there's this world of, and this is where we really starts feeling like witchcraft, world of magic, a world of, and I'm using the term magic deliberately, of secret words that you utter, or letters that you write, or amulets that you produce, and even to the extent where some Kabbalists argue that they're able to be clairvoyant, or they're able to cause things to happen through saying specific prayers and so on. And that's where people really start feeling that this is based on witchcraft. And I completely understand it. Now, the term Kabbalah itself does appear in the Talmud, in the tractate of Rosh Hashanah. But Kabbalah there has to do with the receiving of information, and particularly the prophets. So when I was 16 or 17 years old, I had to take an exam on Talmud for high school. I went to a religious high school, so it was a mixture of Jewish studies. So we studied Tanakh, and we studied Talmud, and Halakha, and things like that. And then we also had a curriculum that had biology, math, physics, everything imaginable that was common back in the 90s. And actually common to this very day. This goes all the way back into the 70s and 60s in the Israeli curriculum. But what was very interesting is that the term appears there, and it's actually used to describe words of the prophets, that these are oral traditions that were transmitted and eventually put into writing, but they were received. This is the whole idea of the root Kuf Bet Lamed. Now, it also sounds like the word Cabal, but there's no connection there. Well, there actually might be some connection at some point in history that the word Cabal was invented, but I never really went into the etymology of that particular word. But that's the original meaning of the term Kabbalah. However, this idea of performing acts of so-called wizardry is not unusual to the ancient world. To such an extent, and please forgive me for saying this, but to some extent, when a foreigner would look at an Israelite prophet who produces miracles, like, say, for example, Naaman in 2 Kings chapter 5, who speaks with Elisha, and Elisha is supposed to heal him, Naaman does not see a difference between what Elisha does and what other magicians, miracle workers of his time were doing, to such an extent that he mocks him and says, oh, we have bigger rivers and so on. I don't have to dip in this little stream that you have here called the Yarden, the Jordan. And it was only his servants who said, but my Lord, he says a great thing here. There is an understanding within academia that really, in truth, when we look at miracle workers in the Bible, people in the ancient world did not really see much of a difference between them. The line was that the miracle worker is not using magic. There's a concept here. The idea is that the God of Israel does not need magic and is not bound to the laws of so-called nature. Now, the difference between nature and magic and the divine and so on, in the ancient world, there was no separation between them. Everything was linked to one another. Therefore, gods existed within nature, and gods also used magic to do whatever they need to do. We find this, for example, in the Enuma Elish. It doesn't matter if we're talking about the Sumerian version. This is the creation story, the Babylonian or Sumerian creation story. It doesn't matter if it's the Sumerian version or if it's the Babylonian version or the Assyrian version, if it's Marduk or Ashur. It doesn't matter. When this, whatever deity you pick to talk about, goes to war against Tiamat, which sounds a bit like the word Tehom, and Epsu, the two gods who decide to attack the elder gods and so on, he takes magical instruments. He takes magical weapons with him. He girdles himself with magic to fight this goddess and this goddess, and then her husband, the male god Epsu, the god of sweet water, where Tiamat is the goddess of salt water. And this shows us that the idea was that gods use magic, and therefore human beings can manipulate this type of material and cause the gods and the magic in the universe to be bound to their will. This is also the idea what Bilam does in the book of Numbers, where he tries to manipulate magic through building altars and doing very specific acts to try to bend God to his will, but it doesn't happen. And that's because the God of Israel is presented as being not bound to nature and therefore not bound to magic. And this is the difference. When a Kohen in the temple does Yom Kippurim or manipulation of blood and so on, he is not doing this through the concept of magic, even though from the outside it looks like as if it's the same. And there was blood manipulation in other cultures as well. There was at least one culture, the Hittites, who did this. My dear teacher, Dr. Yitzhak Feder, wrote a whole book about this quite a few years back. And the idea is that the Israelites work with similar concept, but from a different perspective. And this is, by the way, how Kabbalists explain the fact that what they do and what they teach is so similar to the esoteric magic concepts of other cultures, like the Zoroastrians and the Christians in Europe and so on. And there is a connection between Kabbalistic teachings and the development of esoteric magic concepts of Europe, but they do come from slightly different cultures. Europe, it's more to do with the religions that came in there by the Goths and by the Germanic tribes, and eventually the practices of the Nordic groups and the Celtic magic and so on. It has its own realm, but there is a connection there. And then eventually, when we start entering the Renaissance and so on, there's the Neoplatonian movement that deliberately adopts things from Judaism, and they start looking for Kabbalistic writings and so on. They were quite a weird bunch of people, but they are the basis of a lot of the magic concepts that we find today. Now, when an Israelite goes to a miracle worker, he's expecting the miracle worker to really beseech God for them and not, manipulate magic and so on. This actually might be the mistake that Elisha made by giving his staff to Gehazi and telling him, go heal that child. No, you have to get up and go there and ask God to do so. So there is a hint within the book of Kings that the prophets sometimes make mistakes and they start thinking, oh, I actually have a power. And that teaches us that no, you're not. You do not. You need to do this under the supervision of God himself. And that's the only way it works. So when we enter the Second Temple era, there's a change within the Jewish world. Within, I'm going to use the term Jewish, but I don't really mean Jewish. I mean the Judeans and the Galileans and so on, because we're not really talking about Judaism yet. Prophecy is in severe decline. And people are looking for healers, people are looking for medicine, people are looking for communication with God, and this opens up a door for miracle workers. And we can say quite easily, and this is described in Josephus and other sources, and there's research that's been done on this, that in the Second Temple era, there was an entire industry, I would say, to put it into our terms today, there was an entire industry of people that basically sold miracles for people that wanted healing or knowledge about God and so on. And by the way, this is no different than false prophets of the First Temple era and other people that did things like this as well. But the market becomes really, really big in the Second Temple era, which starts the process of producing the apocalyptic writings. These are writings which existed during the Second Temple era. We have bits and pieces of them. We have fragments from the Dead Sea Scrolls. We have Greek and Ge'ez, Ethiopic versions of these. And there's some that came from Eastern Europe and so on. And these are books that claim that the writer, who is a pseudepigrapher usually, claiming to be Enoch or claiming to be Baruch or Ezra the fourth, Ezra the fourth, but the fourth Ezra, and other many books. Enoch, by the way, it's a whole literature. There's something like 7 books, which are called the books of Chanoch. They're part of the Enochian literature. It's not really one book. And they talk about, for example, the books of Hechalot, which is one of the most important books in this series. And what we discover in these books are descriptions of vast realms and angels, and we have the Book of Watchers, and the Book of Watchers describes all these angels and expands on the story of the fallen angels, even though it's only one verse in Genesis 6, and it becomes this entire literature, and people writing about the Nephilim and so on. And by the end of the Second Temple, Judaism is saturated with this apocalyptic writings. And what this leads to is that rabbis, the early version of rabbis, are also part of this culture. And therefore, as part of this culture, these concepts are acceptable. But as rabbis as well, they also want to start working on the practical. They actually want to be involved not just in the philosophical, theoretical study of things, but the actual practicality. And this is where we have to split Kabbalah into 2 concepts: the philosophical, esoteric teachings, and the practical, magic Kabbalah. Now, the philosophical, esoteric teachings, these are things that were kept under wraps for a very, very long time, until around the time of the Hasidic movement, 1,500 years later, when they start teaching these things more in public and breaking the walls that usually said you're not supposed to teach these things, especially in Europe. The Kabbalists of Ashkenaz, these were very old school Kabbalists. In the Sephardic countries, it's a really interesting story, but we'll get to that later on. And what happens is you have rabbis kind of dealing with these methods of maybe manipulating reality and so on, and this is kept really under wraps to such an extent that it's so secretive that rabbis who entered studying Kabbalah were never really always taught these things, to such an extent that there were rabbis who were writing in the 11th century, 12th century, 13th century, who said no one deals with this, no one messes with this information, no one actually practically does this. Even though same rabbis like the Ramban, Nachmanides, Rabbi Moshe ben Nachman, says, oh, we don't do these things, but then there's stories about him that he did. And then one of the most famous ones is the Maharal of Prague and the Golem of Prague, the idea of producing a so-called living or animated object that looks like a human being but can't talk, and you have to control it, and so on. And the concept of the golem actually is mentioned in the Talmud. There is a hint that there were rabbis who may have produced such things, but chances are these were just mute servants. These were just humans who were mute servants, and most of these types of concepts were just exaggerations of stories. And this is one of the problems that we have in pretty much any field of folklore, because this does fall in a category of folklore, is that there is really, I saw he had a mute servant, and this mute servant was dirty, and therefore he must be made of mud, and therefore it must be a golem, and so on. And these are all exaggerations. But we do find stories in the Talmud about people who dealt with the philosophical side, and they were able to move it into the reality, into reality of things. And what this meant was that they were able to study the concept of powers, like the concept of chashmal. This is one of the terms that shows up in the Talmud, and what this meant was someone was able to produce some kind of an energy or something, and it killed them, and so on. But in any case, however you look at it, these are things that there are only hints of it. Now, in the Gaonite period, we know, so this is from around the 6th century to around the 11th century. These were rabbis referred to as Gaon, which is a term used to describe the chief rabbi of different communities, of different yeshivot, study halls. And they also write about these things. One of the most prolific ones is the Rav Hai Gaon, which is one of the most important Gaonites that existed, that had ever lived. And he speaks about these things, and he got asked questions about these concepts. We have a responsa in their in the literature that was discovered, and he talks about these things, but he tries to keep it kind of very, very low grade. He doesn't want to talk about it too much. And that was the attitude for a very, very long time. So we know there were lots of rabbis in France and Germany, Italy, North Africa, Persia, Iraq, Syria. They were studying these things. Greek Jews, by the way, by the 1800s, they become very deeply involved in this. And for basically Greek Jews today, even though they originally came from a completely different tradition, the presence of the Sephardic Jews who came to Greece heavily influenced the culture to such an extent that it's very difficult to find the old Spanish Macedonian practices. And my family may have actually come from Macedonia. That's our theory. We were able to trace back some information about this. But then when I wanted to actually discover what were the traditions and practices, I couldn't find anything before the 1700s. And everything is saturated with Kabbalistic concepts and so on. Almost impossible to get the original prayer books because they got replaced with the more Kabbalistic leaning Spanish prayer books, or the latter development of Spanish prayer books, because we're going to talk about Spain in a moment. And what happens is we have all these rabbis, going back to medieval times, all these rabbis, Rabbi Yosef Jiktibia, the Ramban, writing about these things, and then we have Maimonides, who's the great Jewish philosopher, who his God is a philosophical God, an abstract God, to such an extent that I've actually just read a book that argues that we can actually raise the question, did Maimonides really believe in the God of the Bible? Conclusion is he probably didn't, because the God of the Bible is not as abstract as Maimonides wants to present him. But Maimonides goes on the attack, he goes on the offense, and he attacks these Kabbalists, and he writes the Guide to the Perplexed, and he calls the Kabbalistic words, the magic words they use, the Shem Kadosh, the holy names, is complete gibberish. He calls them ugly words, things that don't mean anything. And we know that the same thing happened in Spain when Rabbi Yehuda and Rabbi Avraham Abulafia were trying to teach Kabbalah. Specifically, Rabbi Yehuda Abulafia was trying to teach Kabbalah in Spain. He was attacked, viciously attacked, physically harmed, and so on. Spanish Jews were completely against this. And this is the irony, because everyone thinks, Sephardic Jews, they're all Kabbalists. And they actually were not. It took about 150 years after Rabbi Yehuda Abulafia and the works of the Abulafia family to actually turn Kabbalah into mainstream. But prior to that, they were against. And what's very interesting is, for example, I was able to get a prayer book of the Catalonia community. And the interesting thing there is that they don't have anything Kabbalistic in their books. Now, the reason I got this was because my grandfather had Spanish-Portuguese Sidurim, which again connects us back to Greece. My family left this area, Macedonia, Greece, after the Spanish Jews showed up there. So my speculation is late 1600s, early 1700s, and they end up in Eastern Europe, but they belong to a separate community from the Ashkenaz Jews. And in my family, there was always this very big thing about keeping away from Kabbalah, to such an extent that when I mentioned this to my father, I mentioned something about Kabbalah, my father turned around to me and said, "We don't deal with this type of stuff. We keep away from these types of things." And this was a very important statement because my father kept on saying this for decades. He kept away, he always said, "I keep away from these things." And he was slightly surprised that I actually took 18 months of studying it. And what happens is these writings get collected. And there's a man called Moshe de Leon who lived, I think, in the 1300s, 1400s. He goes around, he travels around, he collects all these writings, and he claims, "I found this book written by Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai," who, by the way, in the Jerusalem Talmud says quite clearly, "No angel had ever spoken to me ever before. Nothing. I have never communicated with anything from the hidden realms." But for some reason, everyone thinks he wrote this, and he becomes the great symbol of Kabbalah. And then we get Lurian Kabbalah, which is a very specific interpretation of the Zohar and a very specific way of looking at things, not the point of this podcast. And then we get the Hasidic movement, which teach a very low-level type of Kabbalah. Now, at the same time, we have the Neo-Aplatonian movement, who are a group of weirdos who live in Italy, and they are basically they're manufacturing this concept called metaphysics, which is, as the term means, it's the meta of the physics. It's not the regular physics. It's a much more spiritual types of physics, and they start developing their own style of this, and they buy a lot of Jewish literature, a lot of Jewish manuscripts, and they're trying to develop their own version of this, their own Christianized version of Kabbalah. And what happens is that Christian writers are exposed to this, and they recognize that this comes from a Jewish background, and they start condemning, and they start attacking this, even though in Europe, unlike the United States, or America at the time, in Europe, the line between witchcraft and Christianity was still very blurred, and actually still is very blurred to this very day. You have people who call themselves Christians, but then they'll do practices like leaving out things for pixies, leaving out a tray of milk. There's an old Irish practice to put a tray of milk at the doorstep for different pixies and different little creatures and so on. And then we also have practices in Germany that go back to Germanic tribes, like, for example, Krampus, the whole idea of a demon that kidnaps kids on Christmas and so on. And on the other hand, in America, we have much more Puritans. So these are people who kind of keep away more from these things. And this is also part of the background of why people feel this is witchcraft, because there's a very strong Puritan background in all of this. Now, what this leads to is a very important reality that when people who come from a much more Puritan background, people who feel much more indifferent towards these types of things, the response is always a knee-jerk. It's aggressive, and it's witchcraft and so on. And in truth, the reality is that it depends what part of Kabbalah do you deal with. There are elements which are very witchcraft-like, especially those who try to do practices of manipulation. There was this period that it was very popular back in the 90s, early 2000s, of people using a shofar reverse and whispering things in the shofar, writing amulets, which is very popular to this very day. Amulets, Jewish amulets, go all the way back into the 10th century, 8th century, and there's even a claim that amulets were being used in the Bronze and Iron Age by Israelites. And there's a book by, actually, I don't like this writer, but he actually wrote something very good, which is Yuval Noah Harari. He wrote about Jewish witchcraft, and he demonstrates that, yes, unfortunately, Jews were involved in witchcraft, and this was a practice of so-called medicine that Jews were using, and they would write whispering bowls that would have spiral writings in them and so on, and writing amulets. And for example, the type of medicine that we find well into the 1800s, and even today, some of the what we call alternative medicine would have been considered witchcraft. If you stop and think about it, giving people herbs and so on, these were all things that so-called witches and wizards and so on, this is what they did. I even heard a claim that the Salem witch hunts were actually hunting down women who were herbalists, and maybe even some of them were Jewish. That part I don't know for sure, but I've heard this concept from several people. So we have to kind of separate out the different pieces. So for example, the philosophical side, it has problems. It has some severe problems, because when you talk about male and female, it feels a lot like the whole idea of Asherah and fertility gods and so on, and things that the Bible fights against. Don't have an Asherah, don't allow this idea of fertility within the temple, don't have fertility practices, don't have the idea of, like, for example, they had in Egypt where the king and queen do a fertility ritual that's supposed to bring back fertility to Egypt and so on. So I understand that problem. There is this very strong sense that this is something forbidden. But the reason they describe male and female is because of the creation of Adam and Eve, Adam and Chava. There's Zachar u'Nekava bera'am. There's a male and female. So they take imagery like this and they turn it into something that is supposed to represent the divine realm, because man is made in God's image. And I think the best person for this to understand these concepts is actually Gershom Shalom, who wrote many, many books about this, main trends in Jewish Kabbalah and the symbology of Kabbalah and so on. Very highly recommended to read. And the other side of it is also the practical side, which is the one that really feels like witchcraft. But remember, if you're taking your herbal supplements, you're not doing anything different than these witches. Seriously, I'm saying this with all seriousness. Taking herbs, alternative medicine, things like that, it does fall within the category of what witchcraft used to be. But today we understand it's the herbs themselves. They have chemicals inside them that help us, and you have to take large amounts of them, but this is what they are. Therefore, we have to be very careful with this concept of, is Kabbalah witchcraft? Because it depends what part of it, because they also used to make little bundles made of herbs as well. So I would say the medicinal side, if we take a rule of thumb, if I may use that term, even though it's a term that's, as far as I know, has a very nasty background. If we take a rule of thumb of this, we have to say the things that have real meaning in the world, like taking herbs, using oils, things like that, making ointments, natural ointments, and so on, stuff that Kabbalists were involved. The man who presumably created Kabbalah, the Baal Shem Tov, he was referred to as a doctor. His name is mentioned in a ledger of I think it was Krakow or something like that, and or maybe Mezibush, I don't remember exactly, basically Eastern Europe, and he's referred to as a doctor because he made amulets, he made things from herbs, he would make ointments for people and so on, but he was a Kabbalist. So it's a funny thing, no one thinks about that this is what Kabbalah is. So in truth, if you want to be that extreme, then stop using your natural remedies and so on. So if we take a bottom line about this, because the main important thing was to really cover the history, but if we take a bottom line about this, Kabbalah is composed from multiple things. Esoteric teachings, which some of them well, first of all, their providence is very questionable. They come from the apocalyptic writings of the Second Temple era, as the late Dr. Yosef Dan explains in his very, very enormous series of books that he wrote. And he was able to, I think he was able to finish them before he passed away a few years back. But he demonstrates very, very nicely that for example, Sifrut HaHechalot, as we use it today, what's referred to as Sifrut HaHechalot in Kabbalistic writings, actually goes all the way back to the Second Temple era, and are found in the Dead Sea Scrolls, and the concepts of some of the angels that we find. And by the way, if you believe in angels in the sense of how most Christians would today, and even Jews, you are believing in things which are part of Kabbalistic teachings as well. You have to be very, very careful blaming other people and actually look inwards as well. This is a very, very important lesson. Angels, believing in demons, casting out demons, very Kabbalistic concepts. When, for example, in evangelical circles, when people lay their hands to heal someone, or in, say, certain churches, we're laying hands, speaking in tongues, this is stuff that falls within the realm of Kabbalah. These are things which are esoteric. These are things which are Kabbalistic. You have to understand that these what these things are. So before you point a finger at someone, think about what you're doing as well. But if we break it down, we have the philosophical teachings, which have problems in them. I spoke about this quite a few years back. I made a recording about it, and a friend of mine actually wrote to me saying, "So your objection is mostly for practical Kabbalah?" And I said, "Well, yeah." Back then, I said, "Yes, that's true, because it is magic. It is manipulating nature, pretending God is bound to nature. The God of Israel is, according to this method, no different than a pagan god." And by the way, there would be researchers, academics who deal with the theological parts of the Bible would say, well, yeah, if you read the Bible, he's not that different. But we do find some places quite clearly there's a difference. So that's another discussion that needs to be had at one point, the nature of the God in the Bible. So that's for sure. Anything which is practical Kabbalah, but we're talking about the things that have no real provable evidence within reality. We're not talking about herbs and oils and ointments and things like that people always used to associate with witches, which, by the way, monks used to do the exact same thing. But when a monk does it, it's a fine. But if a woman who's educated or does this at home, now suddenly she's a witch. So we have to understand there's a lot of things in the background that kind of affect these concepts. But the esoteric teachings have a lot of issues in them as well, believing in beings that presumably are almost equal to God, believing in Satan. I did a podcast years ago, over a decade ago, about hell, Hades, and Hasatan, the origins of Satan, the origins of these concepts. I made this podcast, I think, well before anyone actually was teaching it out there. It rattled a lot of feathers. You can see it on my YouTube channel, on my website, HebrewInIsrael.net. And what's very interesting about this is that there are a lot of beliefs that are witchcraft. They do belong into that realm of witchcraft. Believing that there's an evil power in the world allows to the concept of white magic and black magic. But the Bible, the Torah, does not care about any of this. It says all witchcraft is forbidden. Now, what this means is that in the philosophical esoteric teachings, there are problems. The idea of angels that have personalities, demons, Satan. God is made of multiple facets of things. And Torah says you've never seen what he looks like. You don't know his nature. The Bible does not take any time to really explain what God is. It just says he is. And that's what his name means, the one that exists. And there are problems even in that area. So my practice, my personal practice, is I just don't touch any of it. I keep away from it, and there are so many little details, so many little things that pop up here and there and everywhere. It's very difficult to keep track of it. And this is why if you're interested in using Jewish sources, you should always only stick to the Tanakh, the Mishnah, Tosefta, Talmud, halachic writings, things like that. The moment, and if you're not too sure, Google the name of the writer, Google the sources that they're using. If someone references a specific rabbi, check who the rabbi is. It's very difficult to separate them from one another. And this is why I also decided to become an academic and study biblical studies, because if I want to understand the ancient Israelite faith and what they practiced and believed and so on, I actually have to step away from these latter descriptions and these latter practices, because they are heavily influenced by the mixing of cultures. When Jews in the Second Temple era were heavily Hellenistic, and it was very difficult to separate things from one another. There were also different variations of Judaism. This is why many of us prefer to use the term Judaisms, or now for the last over a decade, I think, or so, I'm seeing more the usage of the term Yahwism. And a friend of mine, I actually helped in a conference, a friend of mine was brought up in December of 2022, where we brought in some of the biggest names in biblical studies in the world from all over the United States and Europe and Asia, and they discussed the atmosphere of Persian era Judeans, Galileans, people who lived in Iraq and Persia and Egypt, and that really, in truth, there wasn't really one form of it. And it won't surprise me if within these different forms there were people who did not see any real difference between the culture that surrounded them, if they were living in Egypt or living in Syria or living in Persia and influenced by Zoroastrians in Persia, or by the Hellenistic version of Egyptian religion during this era and so on, or Persian, and then later on from the end of the 4th century, beginning of the 3rd century BCE, the Hellenistic versions of the religions and so on. And Jews were heavily involved in philosophy, and we know that Jews studied in the philosophical schools of the Hellenes of different sorts in Egypt and Greece and so on. So it's very, very difficult to separate them from one another. So one of the things I'm working on right now is studying what can the Bible really tell us about God and the religion of ancient Israel. If you want to help with this project, again, I'm going to plug this in, Hebrew in Israel, you can go to Patreon, you can go to my website, hebrewinisrael.net, and you can donate so I can actually get research material. Some things I can get from the library, from the university library. Some things I can ask the publishers to give me a copy as a researcher, but some things doesn't work and I have to buy the books and then sit down and do the research. Shameless plugging. So in any case, I hope that this at least informs you more about this. And I would say that the bottom line is, yes, Kabbalah has very heavy influences of magic, of witchcraft. Not every aspect is, but we need to understand that if we talk about the thin line between witchcraft and what the Torah talks about, there is a line there. And the moment you start attributing powers to nature, using practices, writing amulets and things like that, you are probably crossing the line, even if you are dressing it up in a biblical dress. So, for example, can we actually admire the amulet that was discovered in Ketef Hinnom, the silver amulet from the 6th century BCE? Can we admire this, or is this actually some form of Judean witchcraft? It's a very, very good question. In any case, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. I'm Yoel Halevi for Hebrew in Israel.